If you have noted our curriculum as set forth in our academic program, you will note that one of the subjects which we have considered important is the philosophy of history. And so this evening we will present the first of a series of discussions bearing upon this subject. And as it seems that history is a rather sterile subject, as generally considered, we would like to do something, if possible, to point up its importance from the standpoint of its effect upon our daily living and daily thinking. First of all, what is history? The word is broadly used in two meanings. History is basically events, actual occurrences.
What's
Factual happenings.
We're going right
The second meaning of the word is
Greetings to everyone who's tuning in. Say hi in the chat.
There's
And
a
I'm
great
going
difference between
right
these
in
two meanings,
to the zone.
although this may not at first seem especially relevant.
Let's give a listen to Hall,
The fact of happenings,
and I might discuss some things like I've been thinking about, like fear.
but the records of these happenings.
But yeah, I hope they all are well out there. Welcome to the ZnZerna Music Hour. My name's P.T. Burnem.
What are the
As
principal
usual,
handicaps?
we're going to get into some jams tonight. It's going to be super ambient.
Let us go back to perhaps the most challenging part of the historical perspective, and that is origins. All origins relating to our cultures and our
I've got a couple of tools going.
are obscured by a mystery which we call the dark curtain of history.
MPC is running some
We can go
keyboard
back a certain distance,
samples.
and beyond that
I'm running
point,
sampler
we
for a
fall
little bit of
into
rhythmic motion.
uncertainties.
I've got
Perhaps the
Mononoke over
greatest
here.
Basic reason for these uncertainties
That's handling some of the
is
drone
the
action,
inadequacy
but
of
also
ancient recording.
this setup up here is doing a lot of
Up
droning
to
and
a
communicating
period which we will describe later,
with some,
man had
physical
no
objects.
systematic way
and you'll hear those on the
of
mic.
preserving the records of his,
I also have the bells hooked up.
and this immediately gives us
We're definitely going to get into
another
those.
interesting sidelight. Ancient history did not depend primarily upon the importance of events, but upon the nature of the materials upon which the records were kept. Thus, a vital and important incident recorded on a perishable medium may disappear, and did, whereas a less important event upon a more enduring medium, preserved upon stone, or cut into marble or cast into bronze, may have continued for our admiration.
Check this out.
So the first hazard of history was writing materials. The second hazard was that histories must be written, to a measure at least, by contemporaries, in order that later historians may draw upon source material. This material must have existed. And in each generation and each century, man determined, in the light of contemporary emphasis, that which was important and that which required or justified perpetuation. Thus, as we go backward in our historical research, we observe only certain episodes or incidents clearly preserved for us. For such reasons as this, ancient records relate primarily to religion and history. History in the sense of dynasties, rulers, princes, and powerful persons who profoundly influenced the psychological attitudes of their contemporaries. Likewise also, it was the king and the priest who had available the materials, the means for the perpetuation of accounts. It follows from this that the royal records and the ecclesiastical records are the oldest and the best preserved. Even in these, however, there are differences and difficulties. The fall of dynasties, particularly in Egypt, resulted in the obliteration of previous records. And the decline of faiths often caused old records to be destroyed by new cults wishing to remove all record of their predecessor. Thus we have vandalism as well as the natural circumstances of time gravitating against the preservation of history. We also realize that when histories are written by a limited group of persons, particularly privileged or prejudiced persons, we cannot depend entirely upon their validity. In the Greek period, one scholar stood very firmly and said, "The non-factual historian is a traitor to the ages." And this is true, essentially. Because if we receive biased accounts of previous occurrences, the important philosophical contribution of history is damaged. History today is approached more or less psychologically. We are not so much interested in the events which
What
at
up,
one
Preach?
time dominated public attention. We
Feel
are
free to
interested
hang
in the
out.
relationships between events.
Feel free to
We are interested in
Crank up the
penetrating
sound.
sequences of causes and effects.
kiss your babe or whatever
We want to
is
understand
clever. It's good to know you're
why
listening.
it came about that certain insignificant minority groups rose to power and world position. We also want to know the machinery which toppled great empires into oblivion. We want to
Wildflower
understand
Power,
the operation of
One
cause and
Infinite
effect.
Zero. Good to have you
And this
listening.
is recorded in historical annals. Thus we come to what has been termed the morality of history. The evidence that history is a broad justification of the great ethical and moral institutions which men have cherished from time immemorial. We like to believe that from the contemplation of history, we may gain useful instruction for the conduct of our own affairs. This brings us to the next, perhaps most valid consideration. Where does history begin in relation to the focal point of ourselves? Man is surrounded constantly with occurrences. Those immediately occurring. Those things which happen from day to day, we record or like to think of as news. News is what is happening. History is what has happened. The moment an incident ceases to become or ceases to be news, it becomes history. History must therefore not be limited to national, racial, cultural notions. History can be applied to any subject in which a dynamic of sequences can be recognized. As one historian has said, everything that lives is historical. And there are many things which do not have a life in themselves upon which history can also be gathered. We can write the history of the Ford car and the development of the automotive industry. We can write the history of motion pictures. Present conditions continue, we may can write the history of a cell in the human body. Therefore, history reaches into biology, into physics, into chemistry, into mathematics, into atomics. For everything which has a continuance has a history. These records, we know today, must be accurate in order for them to be useful in the advancement of man's knowledge. During the 16th and 17th centuries, histories of strange things are included. Lord Bacon, for example, wrote a work entitled The Natural History of Winds, in which he collected various materials bearing upon air currents, storms, and other astrophysical phenomena, on the assumption that the gathering of all forms of statistical information constituted a form of history.
I got
The hot
these
summer of 52, the cold winter of
triggers
49,
interacting between the synths and the physical objects, so that crash you're hearing is live, as is the
are
bell.
valuable if we know what to do with them.
I love the way that sounds.
We are inclined then to accept historical record without too much question. And in this way, we've made numerous and profound mistakes. Up to comparatively recent times, there have been few impartial historians. For many hundreds of years, histories were written by victors at the expense of the vanquished. The loser was always badly treated in history, regardless of the causes or values involved. Also, history has been mutilated with innumerable prejudices and false accounts. And it has also been unable to penetrate in all cases the veil of deceit which surrounded an incident or a happening. Thus, persons have been wrongly accused. False credits have been given. Proper cause has been withheld. Blame and censure have been misplaced. These things in themselves are unfortunate, but perhaps we can say not too significant when all persons involved are long deceased. The real significance lies in this philosophical descent of history, in which every error becomes a weak point in a chain of logic or in a chain of research, and may cause us to come to faulty conclusions about processes or attitudes which we should hold today. It is useless to say that the individual can escape history. History is a psychological force in the life of every person, even among so-called illiterate savage groups. Oral tradition, which is their form of history, has a vital effect upon the survival of customs, beliefs, ideas, affection, regard, friendship, jealousy, guilt. Perhaps the most desperately detrimental practice in European civilization has been its perpetuation of international, interracial, interreligious feuds, which have become the dead causes of continuing living disaster. Thus history becomes vital to us. And until the 20th century, or certainly the 19th, very little effort was made to record the history of peoples. The so-called private citizen was forgotten by history. Into the limbo of blessed forgetfulness have flowed the careers of countless hundreds of millions of living persons. Yet these careers have not been totally and completely established. Some of the greatest achievements we have today would have been collectives, we have to realize that almost all major changes in the destinies of collective groups have been the result of the activities of individuals. It has been estimated that in a generation such as ours today, the weight of the world's security and its advancement rests in the keeping of not more than 10,000 living persons. All the rest are dependent upon this small group in some way. It may be that with only a sentence that someone uttered would cause millions of others to move. But that one person, remembered or forgotten, who sparked the change or incited the motion, is still the guiding and dominant spirit. Thus history is actually also the record of man's acceptances and rejections of various policies, attitudes, pronouncements, convictions, stated long ago by individuals, in turn perpetuated first by small groups. We know, for example, that it would be impossible today to estimate the effect of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. One man preaching on the Sea of Galilee has changed the course of billions of human lives. We may say the same in Asia, but it is almost impossible to estimate the effects of the teachings of Dr. Mabuddha. These effects continue. It is not likely that during his lifetime, Plato ever had more than 200 or 250 followers.
Wildflower Power Hour.
Probably less. It is doubtful if the dialogues of Plato existed in more than 20 copies at the time of his death. And yet there is no political structure or social institution known to the civilized world today that has not been affected. These things have unfolded and continued, increasing in a strange and mysterious manner. What does this tell us from an historical perspective? It tells us that ideas are all subject to the censorship of history. By this we mean that they must pass through time. And in their descent through time, they are applied by a variety of individuals to a variety of purposes. If these applications fail, or the ends are inconsistent with the needs, the material or idea is rapidly lost.
Oh, yes.
It disappears.
It would be wonderful to have you, Kenneth.
Say that none of these records actually disappear. They do in the course of time, but perhaps time again must be more carefully out. British Museum at the present time contains probably 14 million volumes. It's the greatest accumulation of books in the world. Of these almost innumerable, inconceivable volumes, there are thousands, probably hundreds of them, which will not be touched, opened, or read in the next 1,000 years. The persons who wrote them exercised prodigious influence at certain times. But these influences have not survived the changes of history. Have lost all their talent for us today. I can think of one early group sermon by a prominent divine who was greatly honored in his own day with an it is far happier that he be allowed to rest in the desuetude of limbo. Thus, persons great, young, or important in their own day disappear from our remembrance, and others, almost forgotten, are suddenly revived or brought back to our attention because we have suddenly learned to appreciate or recognize some value, or have come into some situation which they anticipated, or have sensed in them a prophetic mood about the shape of things which now concern us. Thus history is a sieve, constantly sifting out and separating the living and the dead. Living not in the sense of bodily existence, but living in the sense of idea. Dying not of body, but dying of idea, which is no longer valid, no longer important to us. Thus, history tells us an important lesson. It tells us, for example, that there is nothing changeless but change. It tells us that life as we know it is a continuous, dynamic unfolding of potential. That everything that exists grows, and everything that has been obeys the discovery of Galileo. It moves. It has within it motion, and history is a record of qualitative motion, as well as the descent of families, states, or nations. As we go back over history, we are reminded not only of the episodes which it preserves, but of the silences which it also keeps. We are aware of the tyrannies of the past. We observe man's humanity. We observe also, in broad moral and ethical terms, that history is a long record of the victory of good over evil, the victory of progress over decadence, the victory of life over death, the victory of motion over static, the victory of dynamic over immanence, in all fields and departments of existence. History is also the optimistic reminder that in the midst of days when everything seems to be going wrong, that history is the record of a slow but inevitable growth. And history is also a reminder that growth cannot be without interludes of decline, but also that life and death, growth and decay, progress and deterioration, these forces operate simultaneously, and the descent of every culture has had contemporary ascent of other cultures. The falling of a nation corresponds in time to the birth of a nation. And while each individual in history has departed, the great vital motions of human experience and activity go on unbroken. So history is the story of the victorious survivor, the eternal resurrection of life from death, of the new from the old, of light from darkness, a reminder that every night must end in dawn, just as surely as every day must end in night. And as history is the valley and cover of an eternal restoration, a continuing resurrection, as insistent and inevitable as the seasons which follow themselves in nature. So we can understand why ancient peoples in their allegories and symbols associated the story of history with the great cycle of the phoenix. Now this brings to us perhaps a key to one of the most interesting and remarkable fables of the past. A fable which factually and actually we cannot fully explain today, simply because of the imperfections of history. But enough has descended to us to be able to restore in part at least the broad pattern of this symbolical concept. Ancient peoples, including the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Koreans, and the Chinese, those later Japanese, all shared the belief in the existence of a strange and fabulous bird called the phoenix. In the ancient belief, particularly in the Mesopotamian and North African areas, only one of these birds lived at a time. The Chinese said that there were a pair. But the cycle of the phoenix was the life of this bird. And this bird, when it died, first built a nest of flames in which its body was consumed. And as it died, its body burst open, and the newborn phoenix came forth. Therefore it was born of fire and of death, and as such was represented usually as a bird similar to an eagle, surrounded by flames, wings spread, as though soaring upward to the sun. The phoenix to the Egyptians and most other ancient people was a symbol of immortality, but it was also the symbol of a time cycle. Proteus and many others have left us records. Cicero mentioned, so does Seneca. And in
Oh, yeah.
the story of China,
Preach, I'm so glad you found these hot peppers. I can't wait to see you.
resembling a crested pheasant. It comes to us also as the Texel bird.
I don't know how spicy I can get. I get spicy on these beats.
Mayan culture.
Hot pepper beats.
And it is the thunderbird of the North American Indians and the Totem Indians of the Northwest. These birds because in ancient times, the local rabbis, or the keepers of the words, historians, were priests. When the time came to devise a symbol for the Great Seal of the United States, the original design was a phoenix, because it was definitely an emblem of restoration, of regeneration, of resurrection, the escape of the freedom, and of the victory of life over death, of life over darkness, and of wisdom over ignorance. Many cycles were attributed to the phoenix. Some of them have a fair relation to the great sequences of equinoctial motions, others to the great Metonic cycle of the moon. But perhaps the most interesting and mysterious cycle of the phoenix is not directly associated with any of our known astronomical cycles. For in Egypt, it was frequently said that the life of the phoenix was 600 years, and at the end of every 600 years, it flew into the desert, built its flaming altar, and there died. And that it was then reborn. And that therefore, every 600 years, there was a vital rebirth of history. A vital resurrection within And while obviously a great deal of necessary information to fill in this story cannot be found, can no longer be differentiated, because even in some of our best history, events are not placed within 1,000 years, particularly after about 3,500 BC, or rather before 3,500 BC. Still, we can do considerably in attempting to clarify the possibility of the Phoenix cycle. Before we go into this, however, there is a philosophy involved, which I think we should also consider. History tells us that every motion, every institutionalized procedure of human experience contains within itself two factors, two intimately associated elements. One is the vitality, by means of which it shall live, and the other is the defect, by which it must inevitably die. Therefore, everything that lives has the cause of its own death within itself. Every institution is ruled because of its strength and perishes because of its weakness. Thus, strength and weakness must exist together. And wherever institution exists, the corruption of that institution is almost inevitable. In fact, we have never been able to produce a system within which the essence or substance of its own ultimate deterioration does not exist. Any more than we can possess or develop a human body in which the cause of its own ultimate disease is not present. One famous physicist, biologist, observed some years ago, man begins to die the day he is born. Races begin to die the day they are born. Everything that comes into this world by that very circumstance is subject to destroy. Therefore, the only possible cause for death is birth. That which is born can never escape. The processes of crystallization, by means of which its organism will ultimately be rendered uninhabitable. Historically speaking, nations, empires, cultures, teachings, doctrines, all have cycles of existence. And the ancients divided various sequences using a basic unit of 600 years when applied to a social structure or to a political entity, as we may use the ancient biblical unit of 80 years and 10 in measuring human life. We are changing that cycle somewhat, but still we have a life expectancy which has become the basis of most calculations around which we build the theory of our personal survival and economy. Therefore, in multiples of 600 years, certain elements or factors have been distinguished. And even though nations may survive, peoples may continue, races may be strong enough to outlive a 600-year boundary. Within these groups, there are periodic changes, by means of which the original direction or circumstances are altered. Therefore, it is rare indeed to find a philosophy that is not amended, a religion which has not been reformed, a nation, the government of which has not changed, or a cultural perspective which has not been modified in some way after a period of approximately 600 years. or let us say at least that great and critical conditions have arisen in both the collective experience of total mankind and the more individual experience of racial and cultural groups, by means of which 600-year markers can be relatively indicated. In almost every instance that we can conceive, a reformation is actually a kind of resurrection. The purpose of a reformation is to bring something from darkness into light. In this way, correct a serious error, restating the direction of a purpose, rescuing ideas from the crystallization of institutional organization, breaking away from decadence and preserved progress, or in more recent times, the rededication of institution to the service of individuals. This being the outstanding motive behind social existence as it is today. Now we've mentioned that it's pretty difficult to go back into the early periods of human life and find historic records which give us clear perspective. Such records as we will find, as already noted, will most likely be of a political or a religious nature in the early periods. The only other type of record that we may find will be an important mass motion of peoples, like a migration. Such records will also often be punctuated by a distinct change in religious perspective, the rise of a moral code, or the redirecting of a spiritual destiny for a people, a revelation, the advent of a Messiah, the emergence of a great modifying change. As we go further back, we must sometimes go through centuries in which we have no record except legend. And we must accept that mythology can be, and often is, prehistoric history. But due to inadequate records, the relationships of events have been lost. But sometimes, even in psychological relationships have been preserved by mythological incidents, as in the fables of gods and heroes, and in the fabulous accounts of the foundations of peoples. In most instances, even today, in the search for the origins of ancient cultured groups, we have nothing but mythological material with which to work. Myth must therefore be regarded as psychologized history. It must be regarded as man's attempt to validate the laws of cause and effect involved in the emergence of his own destiny from a prehistoric veil or from an unknown historical background. Taking, however, a chronological sequence, I noted down and jotted a few things which perhaps will have a bearing upon our 600-year cycle. Now, these are not taken from a work in which this cycle was of the slightest significance. It's just one of those plain, old-fashioned, prosaic histories, in which, however, the author attempted a valid and careful arraignment of his dates and facts. Part of this material is taken from Major General Furlong's Rivers of Life, and it will show you certain points which I wish to make. In this particular work, he places the date 3600 BC as that of the rise of the great Egyptian ritual, which we call today the Book of the Dead. He says that at that time, forces and persons unknown, because we know no names in that period of any individual, with the possible exception of a few pharaohs, who were not the motivating factor. That at this time, there arose among the Egyptians the great conviction of the immortality of man and the belief in a relationship between conduct and spiritual destiny. In other words, at that time, the Egyptians took upon himself the full impact of the great funeral text, mortuary inscription beliefs, that a good life, well lived, ensured the future state of the soul. This, therefore, would be a very great mark, because we know that such a belief did not exist at that time. And we have no evidence even of its existence in Asia. Historical evidence. We have mythological, which may be true. But General Furlong points out this date as a fairly certain one, upon which to base one of the most important spiritual convictions, which were later, one of the convictions which were later to profoundly influence the entire record of human life. Dropping, in this case, down toward the Christian world, from 3,600, 600 years, to about 3,000 BC. Let us see what was happening at about that time that might have some bearing. According to the Hindus, this date corresponds approximately with the beginning of the Kali Yuga. Now, the Kali Yuga, or the Black Age, was to the Hindus the beginning of the great karmic age of retribution, which was to continue for 432,000 years. And we are now enjoying ourselves in about the 5,000th year of the Kali Yuga. And the Hindu, describing in his ancient sacred books the conditions of the Kali Yuga, says that during this great period, men shall remember and observe certain things. First, that every man who has an arm shall be called a Raja. Substitute Cadillac for elephant, and I think you get the idea. In other words, every man who is rich is a prince. The second thing that will mark the era is that man shall depart from the law, and during the Kali Yuga shall develop great systems of philosophy or science which deny the existence of God. That was written 2000 BC. The third point in connection with the Kali Yuga, which was of great interest to the people of that time in attempting to predict the shape of things to come, was that during this great day of darkness, or this great era, the family and the home would collapse, and individuals would place their own satisfaction above common good on every level. We're doing all right with the Kali Yuga, but we are not too happy. Now it is interesting that this date should correspond in the Egyptian chronicle with the date of the death of Osiris. Now obviously the death of Osiris is a mythological date. Therefore we are quite possibly in the presence of an overlapping testimony of cycles.
I really
The
like
death
this
of
song.
Osiris is described in the Egyptian
When
rituals
the
as the end
noise
of the
swells
Golden
up,
Age,
it triggers a opening of a gate.
or the end of the Age of the
Symbols
Gods,
get triggered.
differentiating between the divine kings and the human kings ruling the world. This date would correspond very closely with the concept, therefore, of the Kali Yuga. Kali meaning black, of course, and Yuga meaning age. This date further corresponds with the Greek mythological record of the Battle of the Titans, in which the gods were driven from the earth by giants, and the kingdom of heaven was overthrown, or at least was forced to retire from the active participation in the estate of man. This date then also corresponds with the ancient date of the founding of the oracles, which were to take the places of the direct contact between the divinities and humanity. And the beginning of the oracles would also correspond in the ancient Hindu doctrine with the beginning of the great age of the rishis, or the heaven-sent teachers, who were to link man and the gods. So in all these different cultures, the year 3000 BC is either historically or mythologically related to an incident which may be regarded as the end of a divine era, or an age of ancient things. Now continuing on our descent, we come to the year 2400 BC.
I'm really enjoying myself tonight. It's nice to have like no drums, just try to
The
take it
great
slow.
German Orientalist, Professor Max Müller, says that the year 2400 is the year which dates the keynote of universal religion. This is interesting that these dates fall in these patterns. Müller believed that at that time he was able to trace the rise of a common spiritual conviction extending throughout ancient cultures and binding them together and establishing the foundation for the later interchange of philosophy, science, religion, art, and culture. But prior to this time, the isolations of beliefs were so complete that the possibility of a common foundation did not exist. Therefore, Müller says that at this time was to be placed the greatest single unfoldment of human hope toward a better time that marked the early period of history. This, I think, is well worth our attention. Continuing downward toward the Christian era, we then come to the year 1800 BC, which, according to the Hindu record, marks the end of the period of the Vedas, or what is called the Great Vedic Era, and the rise of what was known in Asia as the Mantric period. Now, the Mantric period was that which marked the transition between law and intercession in religion. In other words, it was the beginning of the rise of the ethical religious concept in Asia, as we know it. This does not mean that the earlier peoples had no ethics, but it does mean that at this time, the ethical emphasis came to dominate religion. And religion began to separate itself from a legistic code, the eye for an eye and the tooth for a tooth concept, and began to move toward the forgiveness of sin and the doing good to those who injure us. It was a great period.
Hello, Brother Jeff.
Truth and love.
It's good to know that you're out there listening.
Victorious over strength and law.
All the hearts for you.
It was the victory of love over law.
Really glad I'm going to see you in March.
But the reinterpretation of law, so that the strength of God and the power of God began to be deeply considered
Now,
as the love of God.
When
And deity
he's talking about God, really, when I'm feeling is this sort of undiscovered interconnectedness of all things.
Or the
Powerful manna inside of the now.
in relationship to the affairs of mankind.
Not separate from mankind.
Corresponds fairly closely with the Jewish Exodus and the rise of another group of important culture factors.
Spurs first.
The rise of a powerful monotheistic teaching in both Egypt and the Near East. A redefinition of deity and greater emphasis upon the worship of deity as this related to the continuance of the life and happiness of the individual. In other words, personal worship taking the place of state ceremonialism as a form of religious observance. The year 1200 in age, 1200 BC, dates the birth of Rama, the great avatar of Vishnu, and is the great cycle of
We're going to get back into some of those piano notes.
the great classical work, which was also a powerful landmark not only in Asia, but in other parts of the world. The Ramayana introduces us to a new concept of human relations. It is the beginning of the glorification and deification of the natural relationships of human beings. In the Ramayana, the faithful husband and the faithful wife emerge as performing the ritual of faithfulness, that affection for one's brother, common regard for other human beings emerges as part of the basic ritual of religion. So we see graceful and peculiar steps moving down. This period also coincides with the period of the compilation of the oldest 14 books of the Old Testament, the beginning of the rise of religious ritual as we know it today. But prior to that time, a work such as the Bible or any collection of essentially religious works, comparatively unknown. Prior to that, most of the so-called sacred writings were in the form of ethics, relating to the origin and histories of people, but not emphasizing a class of spiritual writings set apart as scripture, constituting holy text. The next period then, after that, comes the 600 BC. It is then we pause the presentation where we have and this has been well pointed out.
Sending manna over the alley cats. Right now. Just cats. Thank you for being so much a part of my journey, Jeff. and so many others. I love this shit.
Pythagoras in Greece, and several lesser luminaries, including the so-called great sophistic school of the Greeks, and the rise of several minor sects in India and China. Thus we have living together a number of the greatest thinkers that we know, who were also living at the time when the great integration of the Old Testament was at its height. For we know that the Old Testament, the Septuagint version, as we know it today, was in the process of compilation, and that most of the books of the Old Testament that we now have were either revised completely or brought into powerful new organization between the 5th and 6th centuries BC. This whole period fits together and results in the emergence of a movement led almost immediately by Socrates and continuing on with pressure and force throughout the civilized world. We have no proof that these men met, although we have certain possibilities. We have reason to believe from the ancient Chinese annals that Confucius, as a young man, did meet Lao Tzu as the older teacher. The tradition, I would say, has reached a degree of being semi-historical. It is rather strongly supported. There is also a definite tradition among the Greeks that Pythagoras did study with the last of the Zoroastrians. This, however, is open to some question for the reason that the term may have been applied to a priesthood rather than to a person. As the Zoroastrian holds that tradition, it may have been a term covered by a priesthood. Pythagoras, having visited India, may have come in contact with Burnem, or at least met some of his disciples. Produce simultaneously a type of instructor who usually is called forth by emergency. Vishnu is made to say, when virtue fails upon the earth, then I come forth. Now, at the time of Pythagoras, Greek culture was young. At the time of Zoroaster, the last Zoroaster, if he flourished 600 BC, Persian culture was old. At At the time of Buddha, we can say that Hinduism was decadent. At the time of Confucius and Lao Tzu in China, we know that Chinese history was comparatively young and the culture comparatively strong. Therefore, we cannot say that these men appeared to read obituary rituals over the deaths of peoples, nor can we say that like the seers of old, they came to stand at the cradle of new cultures. This cannot be said. What then do we find as the common denominator? The common denominator appears to be that all of these groups, young or old,
No.
afflicted with certain
We're just
limitations
enjoying
and
ourselves in
internal
here.
corruptions.
Oh my God.
These men all
Crowd is
moved
impossible.
against what might be termed man's inhumanity.
Sup,
to
dogs?
man.
I can't see it. I went there once with Liz.
They moved
That was
against
all I
the
needed.
tyranny of privileged groups and the suppression of the rights of individuals. Buddha fought to overcome a caste system in India that was as strong as the slavery of the later world. Lao Tzu was completely disillusioned with the mental, spiritual life of China. Confucius was seeking a restoration of just government for his people and the establishment of a higher level of cultural education, not only for the masses but for their leaders. Pythagoras came at a time which was a transition in the entire life of Greek thinking, because he emerged with the rise of the sophists, or the professional educators of Greece, and was in strong rebellion against the commercialization of education. Each one had his own particular problem with which he was working. But that all these different problems should link together to produce this peculiar historical cycle is, to say the least, interesting and significant. It is a series of coincidences which have not since been repeated. And yet we do have repetitions of other kinds that are stimulating to us. For example, the tremendous emphasis upon music in the 18th and 19th centuries, the great rise of arts in the Renaissance, and the extension of various cultural motions which come to climactic periods and then
Dark.
decline.
For sure.
There seems therefore to be a time and place for everything under the sun.
There's even a time and a place for
These
some
times
dogs.
and places appear to be more than accidental. They represent some kind of a definite pattern. A pattern which seems to tell us that human beings get into major trouble as groups
That's
about
right.
every 6 centuries. They get into a situation from which it does not seem that they can easily extricate themselves. Or they reach a critical point in which, if they continue, would lead to the premature disintegration of their civilization. It is quite possible that had not Pythagoras become the great spokesman of Greek learning, that the golden age of Pericles could not have followed. For we do realize that it was the tremendous shift to a philosophical basis which he instituted that became the impetus, or bestowed the impetus, upon the great rise of philosophy in the Greek states, resulting in about 600 years of philosophy in Greece. philosophy which definitely continued until the final disintegration of the original academy and the falling apart of Greek national existence under the inroads of the Roman Empire. Now it's interesting also to note that the last Greek philosopher is said to have died.
What were the Bell riots of
680,
2024?
which would be again one of these climactic periods. Therefore,
One
it
of these
took
climactic
considerable
periods,
time
perhaps?
for the final disintegration of the direct impetus of these schools. The contribution made by Buddha, beginning in the 6th century and extending through the long years of his own life, continued down with comparatively slight change till about the beginning of the Christian era. 600 years after Buddha rose the great reformations which have been attributed to Sankaracharya. And these reformations resulted in the complete shift of Buddhism and the rise of the Mahayana, or Great Vehicle. And the principal leaders of that Great Vehicle movements were contemporaries of Jesus and lived 600 years after Pythagoras. Thus, the peculiar involvement of these dates becomes important. Another important point that I think we should realize, and which perhaps has lost a little of its validity in our modern thinking, is that in antiquity, the great changes that were to be noted in the descent of man are always upon the levels of religion and philosophy. Nations rise and fall, states come and go, kings overthrew each other. But the major motions in those periods were not the result of or the result of the corruption of dynasty, except indirectly. The great changes were due to the rise of individuals who made positive claim to revelational insight, or who claimed a ministry, or claimed a right to contribute to the spiritual enlightenment of fellow men. Thus, at the time we mentioned, and also at the time of the beginning of the Christian youth, the principal motions originated in man's religious connections. These were the motions which made way for education to rise. I think we should therefore say that 600 years BC approximately dates the beginning of man's formal concept of education. It is assumed generally, historically, that the Academy of Pythagoras and Crotona was the first formal educational institution in the Mediterranean area. There is much to indicate that the school of Confucius was the first broad, comprehensive curriculum of education introduced in China. And we know definitely that it was from Buddhism,
Sounds about right.
emancipating influence upon the public mind, that the great university systems of India received their greatest influence. And the most famous institution of learning in the ancient world, the University of Nalanda, came into being. Thus, the 600 BC date has in most instances been directly associated with religion as educational liberation.
Are you talking about the show or
Our friends of that
you
period,
personally?
with the possible exception of Lao Tzu, were not essentially mystics. They were essentially teachers, and even Lao Tzu was a librarian of the libraries of the Chu, the highest intellectual position in China. These men were essentially teachers, not preachers. They came with spiritual authority, but their idea of religion was comprehensive. In this era, there was no division between man's religious insight his arts and his sciences and his crafts. In these days, the total enlightenment of man was in the keeping of the ancient teachers. And the spiritual leader was also the grammarian, the mathematician, the astronomer, and in many cases, like usually, the physician. The records, for instance, left by Pythagoras give us some realization of the broad scope of the man's achievement. He is remembered, of course, for his magnificent contribution to mathematics, particularly the great 47 or the 47th proposition, or Pythagorean proposition in geometry. He is remembered for his researches in astronomy and cosmography. He is accredited with the discovery of the diatonic scale in music. He is recognized as one of the earliest exponents of the formal type of poetry, particularly the use of the hexameter meter. He is known as a physician and an expert.
You should be getting your stickers soon, Kenny.
Number.
And something really exclusive for you, actually. Take good care of it. It's the last one.
In these days, leadership in philosophy implied achievement in astronomy, mathematics, and music. And Pythagoras was a musician. Confucius was a musician. And these men, in no sense of the word, could be regarded as limited to what we might term a theological religious perspective. They have no such restriction upon themselves. All learning was their scope.
We are learning.
In a large measure, the same thing is true of Buddha. And we find frequent references in the ancient Buddhistic writings to his attainments.
Hey, Kenny, I'm happy right now.
Which we regard as associated with him, philosophy and religion. We know that the last of the Zoroastrians was regarded as a man of exceptional attainments in medicine and in many other fields of learning. Thus we have a synthetic approach rather than an analytical one. We find the outpouring of streams of intellectual energy aimed at preserving and sustaining the security of peoples. We have these men, in the same period, the rise of the great lawgivers of Greece, Solon, Pittacus, Miriam, Cleobus, the men who gave to Greece its great codes of law. We also have rising in China great systems of legislative code. And in this period also the rise of Chinese and Indian astronomy. They were rich periods of outpouring, and these outpourings became the strength of the various cultural groups. India remained essentially sound in its Buddhistic teaching for approximately 600 years. China enjoyed the great mystical revelation of Lao Tzu until about the beginning of the Christian era, when mysticism in this field began to move into other manifestations. Taoism is divided into three distinct periods. These periods corresponding again in timing with the Vedic cycle. From these various considerations, we come to a major one then. Namely, that for some reason, nearly every work of man must be subjected to powerful revitalization. Periodically. Today we will say, in all probability, that necessity produced the sage. That in some way it was the emergence in man's own nature that called upon his own brother man to rise and meet that need. I doubt if the ancients would have argued with this point they would also have pointed out that history, being a sequential unfolding record of events, the history in some mysterious way frames this pattern of needs, distinguishes this pattern as though rungs upon a ladder, and that history therefore is an integrated organism. That history is not a record of incidents or accidents, but a continuous report, the unfolding of basic and immutable laws. That these laws are under the control of cyclic energy, and we can gain certain sympathy in this thinking from Spengler's work on the decline of the West. In this work, Oswald Spengler points out all great civilizations are cyclic, that civilizations are therefore composite human beings. And as man passes through birth, growth, infancy, maturity, and decline, so cultures have great cyclic patterns, moving inevitably from their humble beginnings with tremendous energy and little experience, to their ends, which is greatness of experience and exhaustion of energy. The things die of fatigue, and that when institutions die, a psychochemistry takes place. Institutions are merely hypothetical boundaries on the continuance of the unbroken stream of human life itself. It may be that a pattern is exhausted, but the persons living in that pattern must in many instances survive it, and must pass through what we call transition periods, periods of moving from one pattern into another. Thus, every 600 years, the human being confronts a personal emergency. The personal emergency is not the collapse of a cycle. The emergency is the danger that he himself will collapse with it. His inability to face transition. We find this even in the shorter cycle of human life, where it is estimated that very few persons are able to maintain individuality of thought, emotion, and action after the 50th year. By that time, the pressure of circumstances, disillusions, and the gradual depletion of energies results in the individual taking cover in some form, hiding under something, seeking protection, and gradually passing the reins of progress on to someone else. He finds that it is increasingly difficult for him to maintain the momentum of progress. He sees it move by him and becomes a stranger in his own world. Now, every 600 years, according to this ancient calculation, great masses of human beings are confronted with this matter of transition period. These masses of human beings are of all ages individually. The transition may strike one person in childhood and another in maturity and another in advanced years, because the transition represents an arbitrary pattern of climaxes.
An arbitrary pattern of
the fact,
climaxes.
we often refer to the fact that we are living perpetually in transition. We are. When we look back over, for instance, the 19th century, the last half of it certainly was, for most persons, a comparatively tranquil period. Not tranquil perhaps in terms of their personal existences, but tranquil in terms of comparatively low taxes, comparative freedom of action, and the ability to live their lives, if in a somewhat humble manner, much according to the dictates of their own consciences, or according to the circumstances which they themselves had created. Now we come into this century and observe the individual more and more the victim of mass motions over which he has no authority. Therefore, we may say that he appears to be approaching a climactic period. Yet this climactic period may be only one of the lesser transitional situations that he has to face. Certainly, there is continual transition. But there come times when these transitions heap together, forming such tremendous patterns that they require an almost complete reorientation of the way of living. Later we will observe that the beginning of the Christian era, also one of these 600-year points, was perhaps in the earlier periods of things the greatest and most dynamic of these transition periods. A transition between two ways of life that were never to meet again, that were never to have even valid relationships after they once separated at that time. So here we have what might be termed in the 6th century BC the emergence of integrated human record. By some very strange circumstance, also perhaps difficult to classify, but obvious, the year 600 BC is often chosen by historians arbitrarily to represent what they consider the beginning of trustworthy, detailed chronological descent of events. From 600 BC to the present time, we have an almost unbroken historical record. There are flaws in it, and there are weak points. But never do we get into the same dilemma again that existed in the year 700 BC, when we have almost no records of any kind. There was a broad dividing line. Why? Obviously because the training of men's minds under the impact of the philosophic system began to produce the type of thinking which related events and also prepared for the more conscientious effort to explore history in terms of the mental and moral life of individuals. It was not until about 600 BC that we begin to
All right, we're taking it out.
historical records of common people, if we want to call them that. Those uncommon individuals whose lives consisted only of ordinary circumstances, untouched by the great motions and glamours of high office. We begin in 600 BC to meet the farmer, the merchant. We begin to see emerging for us the little businessman. We have some contact with the musician, the artist, even the clown. We find the petty politician who never got anywhere coming out as a person. We also find the interesting emergence of theater and the beginning of a psychological
Gotta say thank you
analysis
to my Digicats, my Zerna cats, Melissa Schick, Gerard Stoltz, Kenny Creech, what up, Kenny? Rin Cat, Erica P. Thank you so much. Also, thank you to Anna Carmen. Just got back on board. Really happy to have you. Mama Cat, Sam Seeger, Eric Akers, what up? Scarlett. Hope y'all enjoy the stickers. Oh man, Dog Fuck. Loomy Cats, Stand Up, Fly Around, Jen Dudley, Austin, Avalanche, what's up? Viz. I hope that you're having a good night. Barry, thank you so much. Your tape is ready to go. Gonna burn it, my friend. Penny is gonna help me burn some tapes for Dust Cats. Everything is permitted. Nothing is true. Thanks, Kenny. Yeah, it's a mix of things. I was really overcome by anxiety earlier today. But, they really helped calm me down. Finding somebody who knows how to move with your rhythms is very fortunate. Very fortunate. All right.
That we did not know anything about. So on this side of that humanity comes into being.
It's been a pretty evening, beautiful. I consider it like a sunset, something that happens once. Although some of the pieces are going to be used for the EP for the Dust Cats. I'm actually just wrapping up the Huxley one. And it's maybe like 15 minutes of cool Brave New World type Huxley era stuff. Alright. Glad y'all could make it this evening. I hope y'all have an excellent week. Next week we're going to be doing more droning and in a different form. I think I'm going to shift it up, challenge myself, and some more Manly P. Hall. So if you enjoyed the Esoteria this evening, I'll be picking out something cool for next week in a couple of days. Matt Singer, Ego Tunnel. You got to hit me with the message. Hit me up on Facebook. Ego Tunnel sounds good. You got to break the back of the ego. All right. I hope y'all's week is full of love. Keep it in your minds. And yeah, have a good one. I'll see you next week. P.T. Burnem signing up.
And valiantly struggling to adjust himself